Well, welcome everybody. We're gonna get started with day 2. So we have Laura joining us virtually, but she's gonna tell us about multinationals. So Laura, go ahead.
And my sincere apologies. I really feel bad that I'm not there for many reasons, not only because my dog continues to be stuck in boarding, but mostly because I actually think we have a very cool paper, and I'm hoping the discussant agrees with us. Can you see my slides? Yes, no?
Yeah.
Okay, great,
No.
thanks. So this is co-author work with the great Vanessa Albiares from the Inter-American Development Bank. I was giving, okay, I now see my clock. So let me start with some motivation, although perhaps in this audience is not needed. As you know, global imbalances, and in particular US trade deficits, continue to fuel debates over external imbalances, and more generally has created a lot of, if you want, new policies related to these trade deficits. Macroeconomic explanations are central, and Marie Oswald just wrote a very nice piece in Brookings, and also Anusha and Jean-Maria, where they go over the traditional macro explanations. At the end of the day, this is all related to a savings and investment gap, in particular recently related to some fiscal expansion, but there's also discussions of the role of excess global savings, demand for US assets, and so on. But what we argue in this paper is that a lot of these explanations have overlooked the main entity, if you want, that has been behind these trade patterns, and those are multinationals. The multinationals are the ones that have shaped investment, production, and trade decisions in the US vis-a-vis the external balance. And so that's what we want to study in this paper. In fact, this was also part of a speech that Christine Lagarde gave at an event at the IDB, where she mentioned that global imbalances have once again moved to the forefront of international debate. Trade with the US is broadly balanced. A good surplus is offset by a service deficit. And indeed, she mentioned that all of this is driven by US multinationals. And so if you look here at the role of manufacturing employment in US affiliates, in particular here, we're using affiliates, majority-owned affiliates that have more than 50% US ownership. The correlation of this employment abroad of US multinationals in affiliates is very negatively correlated with the US trade balance in goods. This correlation is relatively high, close to 0.75%. This correlation between employment of affiliates abroad in manufacturing is also very much related with manufacturing employment in parents. This is also the case when we look at trade services. So the correlation is actually higher. So this is, again, manufacturing employment of affiliates abroad, and this is the US trade balance in services. So this correlation is very high, it's close to 95%. When we look at employment of US parents in services, again, a very high correlation. So this is what we want to do in this paper. What we want to do is to study how the US global expansion and the organization of multinationals have shaped US trade imbalances. And we're going to present a series of findings. The first one I just showed you is this very high correlation between the expansion of multinational activity that, as I mentioned, dominate US trade, and the external imbalances. This correlation is not only in deficits in goods, where the rise foreign production and sourcing by US firms is very correlated with the trade deficit, but it's also correlated with the trade surpluses. Also, this expansion of US multinationals, here more related to intangible services, is highly correlated with the service surpluses. We're going to look in more detail at the role of multinationals in driving this deficit, and we're going to find that it is not, in an accounting sense, driven by multinational activities. bilateral intra-firm trade and multinational affiliate trade has been very small and stable. In a direct accounting sense, what is driving these deficits is actually the transactions between independent domestic firms and foreign suppliers and foreign multinationals, so what we call non-US multinational firms. However, we're also going to document that even though in a direct accounting sense, US multinational activity is not driving these imbalances, indirectly is doing it through the global production networks that is shaping across borders. So there's a very long literature related to this topic. Let me just go through some of the if you want, the big headings. So as I mentioned, it's very much related to the whole discussion at the macro level of global imbalances. In particular, what we're going to add to this discussion is we're going to shift from the macro aggregates to how production is organized at the firm level. In terms of multinational production and trade, again, there is a very long literature, and apologies for all the people in the room that we haven't cited. We do know that this is a very long literature because the field has study how multinationals dominate global trade, but also what is shaping their decisions to keep certain activities within the boundaries of the firm, outside the boundaries of a firm, and how all of these decisions shape global patterns. What we're going to do is link this organization, a multinational organization, to imbalances, and we're going to document that the deficit is not really driven by these intra-firm trade activities. Again, there's also a long literature studying whether these decisions are driven by vertical or horizontal motivations. We're just going to do an empirical decomposition of these patterns. And there's also a whole literature that has been looking at the role of net income and the returns to different forms of assets. In particular, this is related to a discussion by Hausman and Schutzenegger about the dark matter, the role of intangibles, associated again with multinationals, and we're going to link this again to this surplus in deficit, but this is also related to this transformation of multinationals and US activity from goods to services in which Peter has contributed. So again, we're going to go beneath these macro patterns and look at the role of multinationals. So in the paper, we start by accounting for the US multinational trade deficit. We look at it by firm type. We divide by US multinationals versus non-US multinationals. Then we divide US non-US multinationals in what are foreign multinationals and domestic firms that are not multinationals. Then we look at bilateral trade patterns, and in particular, we look at the footprint by countries. Then we go into some regression analysis to see if US affiliate activity can explain the evolution of bilateral trade deficits. And we finish with some expansion of the US multinationals across sectors, countries, and time. So in terms of the paper, we're using what we call this newly harmonized data set on global operations, using data between 1983 and 2023. The unit of analysis is the host country, sector, and year. We have 202 countries, 10 regions, and 30 sectors. We argue that this is a contribution of our paper because this data is actually public. Everyone can download this data from the BA dataset website, and that's what we did. It turns out that the files are not research ready. Because of the span of the data, there has been many changes in the industry classification, country names, and the file structure. So we had to harmonize this at the country, industry, country sector, and industry region level. And we're making these files available for researchers. Just to give you an idea what we're showing, and this is just the data, we have harmonized this data to be able to be used by researchers. As you can see here, this decomposes the role of majority-owned firms relative to all affiliates. In the case of the US, multinational activity is dominated by majority-owned firms. perhaps except in the case of China, that there's a little bit more activity by affiliates. We're also harmonizing in terms of industries and in terms of countries. And as I said, we're making available all of this data in our websites. And so the data set that we use is at affiliate and parent levels, sales, employment, assets, and trade. We're looking at sales by destination. We're dividing between the host domestic market, the US parent, or third countries, by affiliation, whether it's the parent with affiliates or unrelated parties. And as I said, we're looking this at 4 decades. We divide the classification of the firms by type into US multinationals. The main analysis is for majority owned, but we have robustness for all affiliates, foreign and domestic. And as I said, we also look at type of affiliation. So first we start by accounting for the role of different type of firms in the US trade deficit. So here I'm showing you a US trade deficit since 1983, and we're dividing it by type of firm. And in particular, we're looking at US multinationals, that is in red. So this is the exports and imports of US multinationals. And in blue is everything that is not a US multinational. And that is going to include foreign multinationals and domestic firms. And so here you can see the growth of trade by multinationals, in particular US multinationals. The growth is close to 16 times. And US multinationals trade is large. In fact, it dominated trade, both in exports and in imports. Eventually, in terms of imports, non-US multinational started to dominate trade. And 2 nice little facts start to emerge here. The first one is that the trade of US multinational, the net trade, as you can see, this red solid line, is very stable and mostly small. What has been growing is the trade deficit of the firms that are not US multinationals, which is this solid blue line. We unpacked a little bit the role of US multinationals, and we divide the trade within affiliates in intra-firm trade and trade that is not within affiliates. So as you can see, this darker red, so all of this is US multinationals. The darker red is this intra-firm trade, and the pink that you can almost not see is this unaffiliated. And again, most of the trade among multinationals is inter-firm trade, and that trade also has been relatively stable. And so what has really been, in terms of this trade, what has been driving this deficit has been the non-US multinationals. And so, again, the US trade in a direct accounting sense is not being driven by multinational. The US trade deficit, is in an accounting sense not being driven by multinationals. It is outside the US multinational. So we open up the trade by non-US multinationals. And this is what we do here. We open non-US multinational trade in the trade that is by foreign multinationals, think Toyota, and here is domestic firms. Think about Laura Alfaro hardware stores. So Laura Alfaro hardware store is importing some things that is here, and this is exporting and importing by firms such as Toyota. And so, as you can see here, the domestic firms imports is the one that is growing very fast. The one by foreign multinationals tends to be also relatively stable. Let me show you this a little bit cleaner, just focusing on the trade deficits. So again, this is the trade deficit of US multinationals. Is relatively small, but is stable. But we do know that the trade deficit has been growing. That is the total, that is the black. So what is driving this trade deficit is these non-US multinationals. But here, what plays a huge role, or has been increasingly playing a role, is domestic firms. So it turns out a lot of this trade deficit is being driven by Laura Alfaro hardware store, that is having importing in net more than before. And this is what is driving the trade deficit. Now, we looked at here in aggregate, and it is possible that these aggregate numbers are masking some bilateral imbalances. So here, this is data for 2023, and we're just mapping these bilateral trade balances in log scale against the normalized by total trade of the trade balance. And so in the US, there tends to be a negative relation from countries that tend to trade more or have higher volumes are the ones that are driving this trade deficit, and it's the usual suspects, China, Mexico, Canada, and some of the countries in Asia, also Europe. The color coordinated is related to whether it's in Europe, the Americas, or Asia. But now let me show you the same graph but by within multinationals, intra-firm trade. And so you can see here that intra-firm trade is actually relatively balanced. There is few exceptions, Ireland, this is pharma, a little bit Mexico, a little bit Canada, and you do find some outliers. But for the most part, intra-firm trade by country is also relatively balanced. And you can see here the comparison between bilateral trade and the trade imbalances. And so, again, just in a pure accounting sense, these trade imbalances are not mechanically aligned with the activities of multinational firms. But it is possible that multinational activity play an indirect role. After all, there is work that does document that the shifts in U.S. multinational activity have reshaped trade flows. This is work also done by my co-author. And so we want to explore whether indirectly this reorientation of multinational activity can account for the different deficits that we see in the U.S. So to do that, and again, the question is, do changes in U.S. multinational activity in country C are related to U.S. bilateral trade balances? And so what we do is we look at trade, total, net trade in goods, net trade in services, and look at the role of a multinational activity in that country that we proxy both by sales of a majority-owned and by employment, which arguably one can argue that is less affected by transfer pricing. And so we use additional controls like GDP, returns, exchange rates, fixed effects by country and year. And so beta, what it would mean is that a larger share of multinational activity in one country is associated with worsening of the trade balance in case beta is negative. And so here, column 1 indeed does show that is the case. An increase in U.S. affiliate sales is associated with a reduction in the trade balance of goods and services. Since the trade in goods can be decomposed in goods and services, the net trade can be decomposed in services. Here in panel B and panel C, we do this decomposition, and a lot of this trade deficit is being driven by trade in goods. However, services do offset some of these relations. We also just look at, this is total affiliate sales. We look at affiliate sales of just goods. And then, of course, we find a greater role in the trade balance, in particular in trading goods, and a lower offset by services. We also look at the trade activity but if anything is by the non-US multinational activity. The data allows you to see not only a total affiliate production, but also it allows you to see where the sales ultimately go And so we also explore whether this activity of US multinationals is affecting the trade deficit. So the sales of a multinational can either stay in the host country, they can go back to the US, or they can be directed to a third country. So we run this regression of the trade balance in goods, total, and services on the three different components, and we add additional controls. So again, this beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 will capture conditional correlations. And so let me focus here first on column 1, and we're looking here at the total trade balance in goods and services, and we're looking at different places where the affiliates are selling their products. So when the affiliate sells their products back to the US, as expected, we do see a negative effect on US trade balance. Again, this would be recorded as an import, and we do see this negative effect. That is, of course, also the case when we look only at goods activities, affiliate sales of only goods. Perhaps more interesting, when the affiliate sells to third countries, this is actually associated with a positive balance in the US net trade balance. And that is also the case when we focus only on goods. Sales to the host country are also associated with negative trade balance in the US. Again, this could be that the typical horizontal, we're not exporting, they're just doing it domestically. We look at only the trade balance, and we get similar results. The sales to US have a negative effect on trade balance in goods, a negative effect by sales to host country, and a positive effect when we sell to third countries. And finally, we look at the role of services, and here the results tend to have the opposite sign. Sales to host countries tend to be positive, and sales to third countries depends if they're selling goods or services. In the paper, we also do a decomposition on how multinational activity has been evolving. Here we use the Foster and Halting-Wanger decomposition. We look at the change in log growth of affiliate sales, and we decompose it in expansion at a fixed country composition, and then a reallocation toward faster growing countries. We also do this at the sector, so would be the sector expansion at country sector, reallocation toward faster growth countries, and within countries. And I see that I have less than 1 minute, so let me rush a little bit. So the first thing to note is there has been a reduction in US multinational activity growth. In the 90s, it was 0.81, then 0.74, and then it went down. This is a well-documented fact related to the global financial crisis. It was first dominated by a lot of expansion, although in the 90s we did see reallocation within countries, but now most of the activities happening in reallocation within sectors. This is also the case if we start by decomposing by sector. Let me just, and again, this is a well-documented facts in terms of the composition of multinationals. Let me just finish by saying that the current account is not only the trade, but is dominated by trade. It is also affected by the net income. There has been a discussion in macro that the net income has finally turned negative, a little bit thinking that maybe the US has lost its exorbitant privilege, but this is not the case in multinationals. Multinationals continue to earn a positive return, and what is interesting is perhaps this has even increased at a time where other returns have decreased. So to conclude, we looked at the role of multinationals, which are often blamed by the persistent trade deficit. Using this new harmonized data, we showed that in a direct accounting sense, we cannot blame multinationals for this trade deficit. The trade deficit in direct accounting sense are being driven by non-US multinationals, but expanding, we do see an indirect effect associated with how the multinationals organize their production in general. And let me conclude there. Thanks.
You let me know when there's slide.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
So now we'll have
discussion by Peter Schott.
Okay. Thanks for having me. It's been a fun conference. I've learned a lot so far. I do a lot of exec ed teaching, which often happens early on a Saturday morning, and you guys look like my exec ed students often do. I liked what Paul did yesterday in terms of setting the stage for his keynote, and so I'm going to start off by talking about the context for this paper and then kind of dig into some of the details. And I like the paper, wherever Laura is. I can't see her, but okay, context. So U.S. is moving from manufacturing to services. You can see this in lots of ways. These are the levels behind the shares that Paul showed yesterday. So you can see this big drop in manufacturing employment that occurred kind of after PNTR and then after the Great Recession, which hasn't really recovered. But the big story is where'd those workers go? Those workers went into services. And you can see that kind of marching along, despite the recessions that the U.S. has had. This has been accompanied by, and partly driven by, depending on how you want to think about it, a big decline in U.S. manufacturing establishments. So this is the number of U.S. manufacturing establishments. And you can see right before 2000, around 97, that starts going down. And so lots of manufacturing plants in the U.S. are closing. And the question is, where is the production of those manufacturing plants going to? And so that raises this issue of multinationals, of course. The trade balance reflects this shift, so I really like the figures that Lars shows in the paper. So this is the overall goods trade imbalance, if you want to call it that, and then services. What's nice about this paper is it brings services into the mix, kind of captures that idea of U.S. moving from manufacturing to services domestically, but now starts asking that question, do you see something similar going on when you look at the footprint of multinationals? There's the overall trade balance. Many suspect MNCs, so I don't know if that's not really hard to motivate. You can go on the web and find all kinds of things being written about multinationals. So here's a kind of non-academic-ish discussion, lots of those. But then there's also been some really nice work with multinationals using BEA data. So Aaron, who's here somewhere, and co-authors had this nice paper where they kind of decompose the imports of the United States by who's doing the buying. And in particular, they show with this black line that multinationals importing of intermediate goods starts taking off during this period. Again, this is, manufacturing employment's declining, plants are moving. Now you see trade starting to be reflected in the aggregate, and then when you look at particular suspects, you kind of see it happening where those suspects are. And then they also document the decline of manufacturing employment, again, by the different kinds of firms. Okay. And what's really interesting, and I think potentially capturable even more than the authors have already done, is this shift to services in the US is occurring both within and across firms. So if you think about a company like IBM, big old industrial giant, used to make things like scales, then was making mainframes, and now is basically a consulting company. And so within a manufacturing firm, you see this shift towards services. In addition, we have FANG out there, right? So we have Amazon and Google, Facebook. So at the same time that manufacturing firms are, well, I guess the saying is, as service firms emerge, which is not surprising, you also see manufacturing firms reoriented towards services. And they're looking at the multinational data, and they have the potential to see, is that reorientation towards services, is that all happening in the US, and it's really just the production of physical goods that's going offshore, or do you see some kind of complementarity going on? And so I think super interesting place to be looking. Okay. This is work I've done with Xiang, who's here somewhere, and Teresa Ford and Justin Pierce and various things. But if you look at manufacturing firms, so this slide is only about manufacturing firms. And the red line on the top is all the plants of manufacturing firms. And the blue line at the bottom is the manufacturing plants of manufacturing firms, right? A manufacturing firm is just a firm that has a manufacturing plant. You can see the interesting trend there is that there's these non-manufacturing establishments at manufacturing firms have been growing. What are those establishments? They are things like professional services, engineering plants, things like that. And so it kind of is really cool to kind of think about, is this thing that's happening in the US also something that's happening with the multinationals offshore? Okay. So getting to the paper, the authors address, the way I saw the paper is they had 3 questions in mind that they were trying to answering with this context. And it's a new paper, so I think the authors are still working through kind of both how to sell the paper and motivate the paper, but also what to do with the enormous number of numbers that they've generated. And so the first question they ask, which I think comes across very clear, are U.S. trade balances driven by MNCs? And the answer is no, and I found that surprising. I expected to see more action going on within MNCs. I think the bit more the authors could do, they tend to focus on the goods trade. I'd also like to see more, but it wasn't obvious to me if you could see it, what's going on with the service trade within multinationals. That would be kind of cool to see as well. Okay, so then they ask, do multinationals play some kind of indirect role in driving these trends? And there's probably like me, the many stories you might have in mind for how that could be going on. I think the authors at this point in the paper are doing a really nice job of just setting up, just describing the correlations of what's going on across these different entities. So I'd said maybe because I'm not sure that they nailed any kind of identification, but I'm not sure that's the point yet in this paper. I think this paper is just trying to get this stuff out, and then they can move to something more formal. Okay, so then I think that message came across. And then there's this question of how US MNCs are expanding. And they use the decompositions that Laura didn't really have time to go through very carefully to try to answer that question. And so maybe I'll say something about that at the end. Okay, but for me, I thought what was really cool, and what they talk about explicitly in the introduction, is whether you can see structural change going on within the multinationals' activities with their affiliates offshore. All right, so I have three main comments. The first is that I think they can't undersell the data contribution. These are publicly available data, but up till now, no one, including BEA, surprisingly, has taken the effort to stitch them together. And so I do a lot of work with census data, and there's a lot of pressure inside census to come up with public use products. So the business dynamic statistics, for example, that's out there is something that came out of using the LBD. And so I think this is great, and I think BA would be really happy, especially these days, BA would be really happy to have some of this work offloaded. And so if they post these data, I think they'd be great. Are they as good as using the inside data of firm level? For many questions, no, but for a lot of questions, yes. Like you can get a sense of what's going on, and I think they really should be applauded for doing this. I think it's great. But having said that, again, it's a new paper, so there's lots of little, as I first blush, I was like, oh, this is great. And then I started thinking about particular examples, and I was wondering, what's caught by the data, what's not caught by these data. And so I think the authors could do a little bit, it could help the reader a lot if they went through a bit more detail. Even I've read the appendix, but a bit more detail about what's going on. So if these data come from surveys that multinationals fill out. You can go on the web and you can look up the form, and it's really cool to do that because you can see all the data that are captured. But from the form, it wasn't obvious to me how the MNCs are defined. And in particular, I was thinking about a company like Apple. So Apple is clearly a multinational. It has stores all over the world. But Apple doesn't produce the goods in-house. It uses Foxconn and contracts to do that. So I don't know which exact bin Fox is going in. And since I'm not using the BA data, I can ask that. If you use the BA data at the firm level, you're not allowed to answer questions like that. But I don't know, it must be buried in the details where Apple is showing up in there. But I thought, stepping back, it'd be cool to have a kind of maybe a simple table or a figure about exactly what can be observed and what can't be observed. And the boxes on the top are US multinationals. So these are the different buckets they can see. In the US, you can break out who's a parent of a US MNC, because a parent's in the US, they call it a US MNC. But there are foreign parents abroad, but there are local affiliates, US affiliates of those foreign parents. That's the second one. The bottom one. And then there's like Walmart or Costco or Laura Alfaro hardware store is there. And so they can see these, right, I think. And they show us a lot of good trade, but it'd be nice to know, as I mentioned before, it'd be nice to see more about the service trade. They can see this, like non-MNCs trading as a group with the other side. Here's where I'm wondering where Apple is. Like, is Apple in there? Because it is an MNC, but they don't actually see goods flows, I think, because it's not defined that way. But anyway, that would be nice to know. And then there's the foreign MNCs, and I was thinking a lot of that, and Lara mentioned this, it's Toyota is an example of this. But one dimension of the data that they do have is they have sector-level data, but this far in the paper, they don't do much with the sector-level data. So a comment I'll mention again in a second is, for me to start developing in my mind the mechanisms that are driving the trends that they're showing, I'd like to know more just in terms of story building, I need to know more about the sectors, and that would be a next natural thing for them to emphasize more, I think, in the data. Okay, comment 2. Paper's descriptive, which I don't take to be pejorative. I think that's a great thing. So the paper's descriptive in the best possible way, which is it gives, I think, a lot of information out there. It's very provocative, and it begs explanation. So I mentioned this already. So the regressions and everything are you should think of as telling us about correlations. Lots of interesting and provocative facts, and I'll put the emphasis on lots in the sense that there's these big tables with lots of coefficients, and I found myself getting kind of lost among them all. And so in order to try to figure out how to develop more narrative, I had to package them in a way that I could make sense of more. So they run these nice regressions, several of these regressions. Trade balance, they want to know whether the trade balance of the United States with respect to a particular country is associated with affiliate activity, and they use the lag. And I think what they have in mind is maybe the affiliate goes into that place, the affiliate somehow affects what's going on economically, and that leads other companies to start trading, which aren't the affiliate. And that's why it drives the general trade balance in an indirect way as opposed to a direct way. And they have this nice figure. Laura did it fast. This is the coefficient from that regression for goods, and they do it over time. So they do the regression separately year by year, and they come up with that trend. And they show that the contribution to the goods deficit of lagged affiliate sales is kind of rising over time, making the deficit more negative, whereas it's opposite in services. You look at a figure like this, you wonder what's going on. They're on the same time scale, so something starts to happen maybe a few years after the Great Recession. What would that be? Why is this accelerating? So again, we need more there to try to develop a story, but that would be an obvious place to look at. It's not exactly happening at the same time, but maybe there's something to do there. They showed us, for a static regression, not for the thing over time, that it's being driven by the non-MNCs. That's the theme of the results that they have. And I was thinking there's lots of different ways you could try to estimate this. But in particular, I would like, as I said before, it'd be cool to break that out by sector. I don't think they see the sector, like they don't see HS goods going back and forth, or they don't see whatever, the equivalent of HS services going back and forth. But they know the sector of the affiliate, and they know the sector of the parent. And so you could ask, is it wholesalers that are bringing in all those goods? Is it the Toyotas that are bringing in all those goods? Well, how could they do that? Well, they would at least get a draw on that. They can't see Toyota and Costco, but they can see the affiliates' IDs, NAICS codes, for example. And so I think there'd be a tremendous thing there. And then maybe once you start looking at what the industry affiliations are, the sectors, that gives you an idea for the timing. Maybe there's something that pops out, and you can start building the story that way. Anyway, so what are the potential mechanisms I was thinking of? Again, if you go back to the forms that the firms fill out, like there's a huge page of like all the ways firms could be receiving royalties or paying royalties based on IP, all kinds of things like that. So is that a big component of what's driving this stuff, or is it more the Costco's, et cetera, of the world? Especially if you think about manufacturing firms and service firms in the United States doing so much innovation, which could generate IP, which could lead to these kinds of royalty payments. Okay, text transfer. Maybe the MNCs, by going in, they lower trade costs. And we had a paper yesterday about things being bundled together and shipped. And so maybe when MNC goes in and does things, even in their limited way, from the perspective of how they defined, not driving huge swings in the trade balance, but steady ones. Maybe that changes, the way you can source, the way you can transport goods or any other kinds of costs associated with that, getting insurance, et cetera. Could be that it's something about the host country policies changing and MNCs are just quicker. It could be that MNCs push for host country changes and then that leads other countries to jump in. So again, very rich set of potential mechanisms at play here. That I'm sure they will go on to kind of think about. And then knowing them, they'll probably get access to the firm level BA data and then try to look at them at that level as well. Okay. There's more. Okay, they show lots of tables like this. And that's, I don't know, too much for me. So I did this. And so now, in fact, even within this, what is it? There's three trade balances, goods, total, services, and goods. And then there's three kinds of affiliate sales, right? There's total, goods, and services. And it's actually the lower lower matrix I'm interested in. How does goods affect services, and how does services affect goods? The middle one, I'm going to skip a bunch of slides because I'm out of time, but The middle one is the one that you think about, that 0.77, right? That's because multinationals move a plant offshore, and then they sell to the host country, and they sell to third countries. But there's stuff going on with services that's really cool. If I go through it quickly, there's some sector stuff that they could look at. So there's this one here, this green one, right, which is that the good balance improves if the affiliate sells more services. So that's kind of interesting. And I thought, well, I'd like to know more here, but maybe that's because you sell like a service contract and that helps sell the good. Maybe that's related to IP. Anyway, the authors have so much information they've generated, they don't really answer these questions yet, but I think that lower kind of quadrant of the space there is a really cool thing to look at. All right, I'm going to skip the last one. I did more of this, and I'll just conclude. It's more of the same. I kind of said most of the stuff as I went along. So my last comment is on the decompositions. She didn't have time for this. I didn't really have time for this either, but I found them confusing. So I'd like to know more about how those work. And my wrap-up would be that I think it's got the hallmarks of a really great paper. So it has a great question. So I think we're all interested in the question. Has really great data. I think what it needs now is a bit more story. And once they have that, I think it'll be much better. Thanks.
All right, so I don't know if there's Laura. Do you want to take a couple minutes to respond to Peter, and then we can do a few questions?
Yes. First, let me thank him because I think he was polite. He's right. There's many things we're still trying to put together. When I was preparing the slides, I did realize those tables not only had a lot of information, but I think we put them the wrong way. I think we should have transposed them, and that's why I sent the slides that I'm like, maybe the slides help, but yes, I agree with your bigger comments. We need to organize a little bit better. Endogeneity is always a concern. We have some attempt on doing that, but I think it's better to sell what we have right now as descriptive and correlations. The question on the BEA data, so both Vanessa and I have access to the BEA data, but there was no way we were gonna get clearance before the conference was due. So that's why we decided to go to this publicly available data, which it is the same as the BEA data, just aggregated. It's the aggregation of the BEA data should give you this. And so it has the same little things that BEA sometimes has. So there's some sectors that won't show up because they're populated by very few multinationals, and then you would know which these multinationals are. And so that's the part that makes, we didn't know this going into the project. So that is also one of the challenges of creating this long-term series. One needs to start aggregating in a way that those little things don't become a problem. And so we're working on that. And when we're done, again, we're going to make it available. We're also going to give it to the BEA because in the current world where we know working with the government data has become a little bit tricky, I do think this data does provide a lot of information. The detail it doesn't have is the services bilateral, which is why we didn't do as much as we were hoping. But for the ongoing project, we have access to the BA data, and that's what we want to do. But overall, I do think that the main that does come from this accounting exercise, which I didn't know, maybe my ignorance, but we also couldn't find documented, is that despite the role multinationals play in trade, and everyone who has played with multinationals does know they dominate exports, imports, employment, R&D, they do not dominate the trade deficit. And so if you just want to walk away with one line, is that one. They're not to be blamed for the trade deficit. It is Laura Alfaro's hardware store.
All right, so yeah, let's collect a couple of questions and then yeah.
Especially because we're on Zoom, make sure you use the mic because that's how the sound is going to get transmitted to Laura.
Is it working too? Yeah. Thank you very much. I have two quick questions. First one is about the interpretation in terms of how you motivated the paper. It seems to me that your results are basically telling that part of the U.S. Current account deficit is due to foreign firms. So if we take this seriously, basically what we are saying is that are these firms who are increasing their debt. And from a financial point of view, then the deficit, the U.S. current deficit, shouldn't be that bad in terms of in financial terms. Can we interpret that, or basically we cannot take your results to the financials, to this financial sort of interpretation of the current account? And second question, in terms of methodology, is I was wondering whether you thought about addressing endogeneity concerns by using some sort of attractiveness location or doing business location index to instrument for the parent location. Thank you.
So just to clarify, we find that it's non-US multinationals, but non-US multinationals includes two beasts. One is foreign multinationals, Toyota, and domestic firms, Laura Alfaro hardware store. It turns out, and again, this is a pure accounting exercise, it is also not Toyota. Toyota has a little bit more than US multinationals, but it's not Toyota. It is unaffiliated domestic firms, the ones that are, in an accounting sense, driving a lot of this deficit. So it's Laura hardware store importing from China. That's really what is doing the again, accounting. I'm not trying to say anything causal. This is a pure decomposition. We haven't thought about how to link that to financials, again, because it is these domestic firms. But I think that would be a nice extension. But to be honest, we haven't thought about the financial implications. That was the first question. And what was the second question? I wrote it and I cannot read my handwriting.
I try to open my mouth more clearly and say it more clearly. About using some sort of attractive...
Endogeneity. Yeah, endogeneity. Yes, now I understood my handwriting. We have an attempt of endogeneity in the paper, which was mostly to acknowledge we do know this is endogenous, but we are not happy with that test. And from Peter's comments, we indeed shouldn't be happy with that test. I have to say, Vanessa didn't want to keep it. And I'm like, it's okay, let's just signal that we know it's endogenous. And so we're working a little bit more to endogeneity. Endogeneity in multinationals is very tricky. Everyone who has worked on this does know that it's complicated. But we need to think a little bit about that, and maybe this idea of the attractiveness of the location. The best people have done is this, when they have the short list and they compare the ones that got in and the ones that didn't, but with the project we have, it cannot be done.
Aaron.
Hi, Laura. Aaron Flan here. I was thinking about what Pete said about the story and the picture of the paper. You could imagine centering it around trying to understand what are the specific mechanisms by which tariffs are going to affect the trade balance. You cited, I worked on this kind of split with census data a while back, and having this split of seeing also the foreign multinationals were a big chunk of the trade balance. The story I was telling myself then was a lot of this was tariff hopping, FDI, where there was tariffs on trucks. Toyota moves and begins building trucks in the United States. But when they do that, they begin importing a lot of intermediates, and a lot of those intermediates from Japan and Germany and et cetera. And so really thinking about, okay, if we put up these tariffs, yes, maybe we'll be pushing back on some final goods trade, but we will be bringing in a lot more intermediate input goods trade. And so on net, what does that look like? And I think just like framing it that way would be really interesting. And this is why the U.S. multinationals, you're not seeing that as much because you're not getting the tariff hopping FDI part. So I think that could be a nice way of structuring some of the results and centering it on the big picture topic, which is tariffs right now.
So we also wanted to go back in time. I think there is one advantage of the data is that it does allow you to go to the 80s. I agree with you that is an interesting conclusion that comes up. If you're going to create more horizontal type FDI because of tariff jumping, and again, that was the objective of Toyota, like that's why they came. because they were being bothered, and so they start opening plants in the US. That is associated with trade deficits because they're going to import a lot of parts. What is interesting is that once they open also a plant in Mexico, or Ford opens a plant in Mexico, and I'm talking press-wise because we haven't gone into the BA data, and I do have a clearance, so I do want to say this is not from the data. But once Ford or General Motors opens in Canada and Mexico, that actually is very balanced. There's a lot of two-way trade, and surprisingly for us, very balanced. But to your bigger question on tariffs, Felix Tiltenot is presenting a paper related to that in the NBR trade conference in Stanford. So just some advertisement to someone else's paper. But a co-author just sent it to me. But he's doing the tariff and looking at the effects on multinational affiliate sales.
Great paper and great discussion, Pete. I just wanted to come back to, it's somewhat related to what Pete was mentioning, but trying to frame it a bit more narrowly. So retail trade, I think, is a big part of U.S. imports, maybe up to 25, 30%. And I haven't been to Laura Alfaro hardware store, but I've been to other retailers in the U.S., and when you walk around, you see a lot of products that are clearly related to American multinationals. Procter & Gamble products, you've got Rubbermaid, a bunch of these things. So how do I think about this? This is not, I mean, obviously a lot of the trade is at arm's length, so it's importing a lot of stuff that is increasing the deficit. Is this really untied to multinationals? It's very hard for me to find that compelling. So I don't know what your reaction to that is.
No, so again, that's why the first exercise is let me do in a pure accounting sense. But the second part of the paper was precisely about that. We do know that they're shaping it indirectly. And so those regressions in the second part are about that. It is a lot of trade. It is associated with affiliate sales, not directly, but indirectly through the mechanism that you mentioned. At the aggregate level, we cannot sort that, but that's why we're working with the firm level data to be able to sort that in more detail. But I agree. We also agree with your intuition. The direct accounting sense doesn't tell the whole story.
A lot of these multinationals, they don't have affiliates abroad. I mean, they used to produce in the U.S. and then they offshore. They might be buying things at arm's length. But on the import side,
so this is also related to what Pete said. The data that we use is the same as the BA data aggregated. So if Apple doesn't manufacture anything, our data also doesn't have Apple manufacturing anything. It's just the same data. It is the affiliate sales. And then they also have, production.
Hi, Laura. It's Tristan Reed from the World Bank. Two questions, I guess. One building off both about heterogeneity. One is if you can look at sector, as Peter suggested, it'd be very interesting to know what are the sectors of the domestic firms. And when you say Laura Alfaro's hardware store, it sounds like it's just retail, but it could be local manufacturers producing for the local market. And the second question is, can you look to see how much or whether your results change if you focus in on these kind of tax haven countries that get a lot of attention. So like pharmaceuticals in Ireland is something that people point out. And it'd be interesting to see if you find the same patterns in those sectors, X countries.
So yes, we need to work a little bit more with sectors. As I said, sectors is the thing that changes the most in these 40 years of data. Because there were changes in classification, but also they had to hide some firms. But we do have this in our to-do list. From the data, what is interesting is manufacturing activity in terms of exports and imports. I'm not saying overall, but that looks very stable. And we put in the appendix one graph about that. what grows a lot is financial services and a lot of intangibles. That is what really blows up. And so in shares, the other one comes down a lot. That was one question. I need to improve my handwriting. What was the second question?
I guess it was about focusing on specific countries that get attention, as often as like Ireland and Puerto Rico. Not a country.
Puerto Rico is not a country. Puerto Rico is a part of the U.S.
It has different tax status.
I understand, but it's part of the U.S. Let me put it like this: it's not an IDB country because it's part of the U.S. So in the paper, in the appendix, we do compose by tax haven. We decompose by country, and you do see the growth of tax havens disproportionately also in financial, and you do see it there, Cayman Islands, so on and so forth. Ireland, which tends to be a country that gets discussed a lot, it actually does have a lot of production, pharma, and so we do see there a lot of actual footprint. As a robustness, and I know it's not perfect, we not only did affiliate sales, but we also did people, number of employees. And in the appendix, we showed those results, and they look similar patterns, which would be a way to deal with the Cayman Islands, if you want.
We have time for one or two more questions.
One or two more questions.
There are.
Let me just add that we do know that to do this at the firm level is the best way to do it and will help us sort a lot of things. We were surprised how much you can go with disaggregate data. I think it does allow you to unveil a lot of interesting facts. And I do know in the next years it will be hard to do BA data and census data. I don't have to tell this to Pete. He probably knows it better than I do. And so I do think this is a way we can go around some of these questions while things become a little bit easier.
All right.
Well,
I think we
are ready to end this session, and we're heading to break now.
Thank you.
So thank you.
So welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce and moderate our final session of the event. The theme of the next hour and a half will be industrial policy and where it's come from and where it's going. We have three panelists who will each speak for 20 minutes to sort of lay out some ideas, and then we'll have ample opportunity for everyone to engage and ask questions of the panelists individually and also all together. So our first panelist is Doug Irwin. Please take it away.
I've just come back from Argentina. I know you're jealous because I have a residual tan, and I know it's gray and not sunny out there, and they're approaching summer. I was leading a Tuck MBA group of about 16 students. We spent 10 days there talking to various businesses and things of that sort. The highlight, however, of the trip was Dua Lipa. She just happened to be playing in River Plate Stadium, and I'll have you know that I led the students there. They did not lead me there. So I was the initiator, and we had a great time. But of course, there was some serious business being transacted. We met with a lot of business people, met with some ex-policymakers. One of the other highlights I'll tell you about is visiting the port of Buenos Aires, and we got permission to go in the port and take a truck around and see the containers and the ships and things of that sort, learn a little bit more about it, just to show you that actually I did do this. Here's our group picture on the dock floors. With everyone. And I did snap this picture here as we were sort of leaving, and this is the entrance to the port. And there are 2 lanes for buses, flatbed trucks to come in, where the containers will be put on them. 2 on the importation side, as you can see, and 1 on the exports. And you might think that there's sort of an imbalance there, but actually most of Argentina's exports are commodities and they come further up the river. So Buenos Aires actually doesn't export that much, but that's where a lot of the imports come in. And one of the things we learned is that under President Javier Milei, they've cut the port time for containers from 11 days sitting there to 7 days. So that's a big, impressive improvement, part of the government's reforms and things of that sort. That sounds really, really big, except for this. In Peru, it takes 1 day to clear customs with your container. In Chile, it takes 1 day to clear your customs with the container. So they've gone from 11 to 7. They still have room to go. Interestingly, under the Christina Kirchner's regime, it took 14 days to clear customs because there's a lot of red tape and a lot of things you had to do to get your container through. Of course, we just didn't learn about ports and things of that sort. We learned about foreign exchange controls, how difficult it is to do business, make transactions, very difficult environment for multinationals. We learned about the reduction in inflation, of course, to 2% a month, which is once again great progress. But in coming to this conference, it made me think, does Argentina need an industrial policy? Is that a top 5, top 10 problem for this country? Well, actually, they have an industrial policy. They make their own cell phones. They make their own television sets and computers. And where do they do that? In Tierra del Fuego, which is down by the tip near Antarctica. So here's the way it works. They import kits to make various electronics products into Buenos Aires. Here's the interesting graphic. Watch on the upper right there. Oh, it didn't do it. It's supposed to wheel its way down. Those components are driven 2,000 miles down to Tierra del Fuego in trucks that takes about 3 days to make that journey. There are about 7,000 people in Tierra del Fuego that assemble these things. They're put back on trucks. They take another 3 days and another 2,000 miles to go back up to Buenos Aires. And of course, the cost of a cell phone is about twice what it is in the rest of the world. So they have this industrial policy to have manufacturing in Argentina. Some of you know Juan Carlos Halleck, a trade economist, friend to many in this. He's written about this. In fact, there's a very recent paper of his, because I was just down there and had dinner with him. And there's one interesting point here. The fiscal cost of this protection trade tariff regime, because there are a lot of tax exemptions to get businesses down there, is $1 billion a year. $1 billion a year. Can Argentina, which has this huge fiscal deficit problem that they're finally getting under control, can they afford to spend $1 billion a year ensuring that they have domestic production of electronics in Tierra del Fuego, about 2,000 miles from the capital city where most of the population is? And he is trying to come up with other proposals for dealing with this. In fact, the government of Milei, as you know, is trying to really bring about big changes and wants to sort of shut this whole thing down. And here are some of the 7,000 workers in Argentina, in Tierra del Fuego, who are protesting this move. Well, that brings me to back to the subject of this conference. Does Argentina need an industrial policy? Well, they have one. They're trying to get rid of it. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the things the government does in Argentina to bring about import substitution, essentially. They're really just striving to get macroeconomic stability. They're really just striving to get microeconomic reform and deregulation. So another economist that you probably all know, Federico Sturzenegger, who spent some time here in Cambridge, was a professor at UCLA. He's sort of the deregulation czar. And if you follow him on Twitter, every day he's trying to knock down some more barriers to doing business in Argentina. But let's broaden out the question then. Does Uruguay need an industrial policy? Is that a top 10 problem for Uruguay? Does Paraguay need an industrial policy? Is that a top 10 problem for Paraguay? So there are two cautions here that I think are very important for countries around the world as they're considering industrial policy. Debt and corruption. So the first one is most developing countries are in a very precarious fiscal situation. And to the extent that industrial policy requires more outlays, more subsidies, that's putting things at risk. So this is The Economist. What's interesting about The Economist special issue just a couple weeks ago is they're mainly talking about France, the UK, the US, the G7. But you could extend their analysis to many, many countries around the world. And as I said, the macroeconomic balance in Argentina is very fragile. And so to say this is the time when it's ripe to undertake all sorts of new industrial policies, I'm not sure that's worth it. And they're trying to save that $1 billion just by shutting down Tierra del Fuego. So the fiscal cost of industrial policy is something I think most countries have to take very seriously. Second, corruption. So we're at a central bank here, and I know everyone knows Sargent and Wallace, right? Some unpleasant monetarist arithmetic. Well, how about some unpleasant interventionist arithmetic? Very important paper, I think, that's underplayed in the EJ a number of years ago, where they talk about industrial policy. Let's throw in corruption. Not even political economy. Let's just throw in a little bit of corruption. How much does that throw sand into the wheels of the cost-benefit calculation of industrial policy? Turns out it doesn't take much corruption to sort of undermine a lot of the net benefits that you might get from industrial policy. And then you say, okay, well, who's corrupt in the world? And of course, there's Transparency International to do all these surveys and things like that. And if you're sort of orange or red, that's not good in terms of corruption. Does that include just a few pockets in the world or a lot of the world? Well, it looks like it's quite a bit. And I dare say, if you go to Egypt, is industrial policy a top 10 priority for Egypt or many other countries around the world? And then the question becomes, okay, what's your cutoff? Okay, let's look at the distribution of corruption across countries. What's your threshold where you need state capacity and not corruption to say, okay, yes, let's give a green light to industrial policy? Well, I suggest we're taking 2/3 of the countries of the world right off. Take them off in terms of that's going to be an important priority. So industrial policy is back. Ricardo Hausmann here at the Kennedy School is someone I deeply admire, and he makes the case for industrial policy here. But he has a very important paragraph, which I just, in this recent contribution, I just want to highlight for you, which some of it gets cut off here. None of this is to say that every government should imitate the expensive policies that seem to be in vogue these days. Policymakers should focus on their country's current problems and choose the most appropriate solutions. Copying other countries' solutions to problems you do not have or focusing on trendy issues are, I think it gets cut off here, a recipe for inefficiency, if not disaster. So I think when we think about industrial policy around the world, we have to think about these issues in terms of how applicable it is. Dave has graciously agreed to moderate this panel, so you must refer to his great work here on industrial policy in the JP very recently with co-authors, and they very nicely lay out the case for industrial policy, show us the wedges that countries or governments might try to close. These are sort of akin to harbor triangles in some sense. And I think an important message of their paper is that you're not going to always get rich by closing triangles. Triangles are not transformative. And that's sort of one the key paragraph here. The gains from industrial policy are hardly transformative even among the most open economies. So it's not as though there are going to be these huge benefits that are sort of lying on the table for a lot of countries, I think, by trying to close these things, even before you bring in corruption, debt, fiscal costs, and things of that sort. Now, of course, there's another strand of the literature that's out there that talks about, well, maybe some countries did grow rich through industrial policy. East Asian countries, Korea, Taiwan, countries like that. Danny Roderick has written on this. Alice Amzin has written about Korea and what have you. Well, I've looked into this a little bit too. So I was interested in the case of Korea. And I want to know, what accounted for their takeoff? What accounted for the tremendous growth success story? Robert Lucas, Making a Miracle, and things of that sort. So I have this paper on, whoops, here it is, on the miracle on the Han. Because if you look in the early 1960s, Korea's exports as a share of GDP was 1%. 1% in the early 1960s. Is it industrial policy that overcame certain obstacles? In fact, what I found in this research is misaligned exchange rate. They had a wildly overvalued yuan. The black market premium was over 150%. How could you export when you face that sort of premium on your currency? It's just wildly overvalued. The US forced 2 devaluations. Early 1960s, guess what happened to exports? They took a big burst. But then they got into fiscal problems again, big overvaluation. The US forced another devaluation. They got it down, and this time USAID, in conjunction with the IMF and other countries, entities, got Korea to stabilize and establish a realistic exchange rate so they wouldn't get that overvaluation again. Industrial policy didn't come till about 7 years after this, with the heavy industry and chemical drive of the early 1970s. Now, this report has been back in the news from the early 1990s. The Journal of Economic Perspectives just had a symposium on the East Asian miracle and sort of a lot of reassessments. It's fascinating stuff. But, the most recent country that's sort of been important here is China, since this report in the early 1990s. So here's where I refer to Caroline's colleague, Barry Naughton, an expert on China, who has this important book on industrial policy. And, what does he say? China's world-shaking economic success cannot be attributed to industrial policy. A lot of other reforms took place before they began to double down on industrial policy. Industrial policy didn't essentially exist until 2006, and certainly has been accelerated under President Xi. So when we're thinking about where these miracles come from, a lot of them come from the release of constraints, overvalued currencies, bad fiscal and monetary mix, and things of that sort. And the more now we're getting research and digging into China, what we're finding is there's a lot of inefficiency built into these things. There is sacrifice of potential TFP growth. There is massive overinvestment, excess entry, inefficient entry, and cost associated with these things. And there's more and more papers on this every month. So let me just give you a quick preliminary assessment of where I think we are so far. First of all, I'll make this point. I think very few countries can play the industrial policy game in a big way. Because when you take into account the fiscal costs, when you take into account the possibility of corruption and inefficiency, the net benefits might be an illusion. Second, we are learning a lot about China's industrial policy. And there are successes to the extent that you can establish capacity to produce, but there's a lot of inefficiency built into this. So that brings us to the United States. What about the U.S.? Should the U.S. be having more of an industrial policy? Here, I think a sense of realism is let's look at actual existing industrial policy rather than some idealized blackboard academic view of industrial policy. The horseshoe theory of politics? Where at the extremes the two parties sort of come together. Republicans now like industrial policy. It used to be a partisan issue. Democrats, think back to the 80s, Walter Mondale, they wanted it. Republicans, Reagan, no. Here's Marco Rubio writing in the New York Times, Washington Post not too long ago, saying, I don't like the Democrats' industrial policy. They're not doing it right, but yes, we should have an industrial policy. So now the question is, what sort of industrial policy? Well, he did want sugar industrial policy, coming from the state of Florida, because it's a matter of national security that we protect the sugar industry. But now we're having a Republican administration that's having an industrial policy that I think most previous advocates don't sort of like. Do you think we should have an industrial policy for coal? That's what we're getting. We're trying to help out the coal industry. We still have the Jones Act, which is sort of the self-inflicted wound where our own domestic, we're trying to save the merchant marine. That's an industry we've targeted, and we're doing so very inefficiently. We got rid of, thank goodness, the National Raisin Reserve, which you may not have heard about, but we are trying to help out the raisin producers. And one can go on. So the question, I think, for the U.S. is couple-fold. First of all, in an era where public trust in government is at pretty much record lows since World War II, so almost a century, is this the right time to invest the federal government with more power on industrial policy? So first of all, there's an issue of capability. There's tariffs. we're going to hear more about tariffs in a moment. Tariffs are a bad industrial policy, but that seems to be the policy choice du jour. The big issue is policy continuity. So if we maintain this partisanship and you don't like the other party's industrial policy, well, President Trump has already said he doesn't like the CHIPS Act. So should we have a semiconductor policy or not? And is it going to change every 4 years? To make these investments, which everyone knows billions of dollars, many years of foresight, can you count on what the regime will be? Okay, so I could go on each of these things. I'm just about out of time. I can't end on a sad note or a bad note or just this skepticism, this nihilism about industrial policy. So actually, I think there is a valuable industrial policy out there. And I think it should and could command bipartisan support. And that's a generalized policy of supporting innovation. Because the social returns to innovation are very, very high. Very, very high. My colleague Paul Novosad, a development economist, I hate to refer to it just X, but this is a wise post. He noted that Pfizer has added billions of dollars in social value, very little of which is being captured by shareholders. They're getting a 5% return. And then, of course, on top, it's just reminding us of Bill Nordhaus's work on that entrepreneurs and others, innovators, only get 2% of the value they're creating. So we're underinvesting, in some sense, as a society in R&D and general activities. Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas has some studies on this, too. First of all, the rates of return are astronomical, accounting for a big share of post-war productivity growth, government support for R&D and what have you. This is, I think, in an era where we've been cutting back on government support for innovation, research, and things of that sort, where the payoff is there. But this is not picking industries. This is supporting innovation that the private sector undertakes. We've had a little experiment. I mean, a lot of people like to bash the big beautiful bill. One good thing I think public finance experts support is full expensing. So we had that temporarily, and we had this for R&D expenditures, we had a boost. But that was temporary. It was taken away a couple of years ago. R&D spending went down. So if we care as a society about R&D, we have to give it that treatment. So how do we think about industrial policy? And once again, my title slide, there was just thoughts. These are sort of random, various thoughts on industrial policy. What about the economic case? Certainly, you can see from theoretical work, there is a case when there's this divergence between social and private costs due to external effects that there may be under production or under investment. We'd want industrial policy, but I think that there's some problems with that, and we ought to think about innovation more generally. That's not selecting industries, that's saying we support this sort of activity where the social rates of return are high. What I haven't been able to touch on in time is the non-economic case for industrial policy, which I think is a very difficult one for economists to analyze. So when we get into the realm of national defense, national security, security of supply chains and things of that sort, are we talking about drones, batteries, semiconductors? Obviously, that's where the public debate is, but it's also one that's very tough for economists to weigh in on for this reason. Could you make your house more secure by adding another lock? Could we as a society be more safe if we invested more in defense? Yes, but there's a cost-benefit analysis. Do we need 3 locks? Well, I come from Hanover, New Hampshire. People don't lock their doors. Should we add more locks? We'd be more safe, yes, but what's the risk? Whereas, how do we judge the risk with semiconductors? How do we judge the risk with drones and batteries? That's a little bit outside of our ballpark, and I think that's where the debate will continue to be in the years to come. Thank you very much. Oh, one last thing. Whoops. If I had one last slide. Just this admonition from Chris Blattman, who's a political scientist at the University of Chicago. We want interventions that are hard to get wrong, not hard to get right. When we're targeting industries, it's really hard to get those right. If we're sort of generalizing we want to support innovation, I think it's harder to get that wrong.
Thank you again. Fantastic. So our next speaker is Caroline Freund.
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to reiterate some of what Doug said, but let me start by saying that I do think innovation is the focus, and the U.S. really has 3 superpowers. And one is immigration, that we attract talent from all over the world. We're sitting in the Boston Fed, a government or quasi-governmental agency. How many people in here weren't born in the US? So it's, you know, half of us. I mean, it's just an incredible, incredible thing. Another is our education system. So both the funding from the government and the higher education system that attracts people from the rest of the world has more Nobel Prize winners, et cetera, et cetera. That's the other one that really helps us stay ahead on innovation. And then the third one is finance, that we have finance available when people come up with ideas, and importantly, it's okay to fail. So I worked in the Middle East for a long time, and there's very little business startup there, because if you fail in many countries, you go to jail if you don't pay back your loans. So that's a real problem, obviously. So so these are what I think we should be leaning into. And the problem is, especially in a country where the administration is turning over again and again, how do you do industrial policy when it's going to be inconsistent? And what firms need is predictability and consistency. So why would you invest in something if you don't think that policy is necessarily going to be there in the future? So I'm going to focus on U.S. trade. I think the session was trade and industrial policies. I'm going to focus a bit more on trade, since that's the direction we've gone to, but I will talk a bit about industrial policies. But first I want to talk about the China shock, because that is the country that I think has, because of their extraordinary success in raising people out of poverty and growth of the country, it is the country that's brought industrial policy to the forefront and made everyone think maybe we all need to do it. And there were two sides to the China shock. And one is the side we often talk about in economic circles, which is the Otter, Dorn, and Hansen, and Peter Schott and Justin Pierce have worked on this, that firms in the U.S. in very concentrated in certain areas couldn't compete, people lost their jobs, so that's what's on the left here. Kind of the desolation of manufacturing, destruction, job loss, and it was really, really persistent, and that led to this blowback. So that's one side. But the other side is in 2015, right around the same time as that economic literature was really starting to make a mark, China came up with their Made in China 2025, their big industrial policy that they're going to dominate every higher technology industry, from AI to EVs to semiconductors. And that really sent shockwaves through Washington. So a big part of the response, I even think a bigger part than just, because if you look at timing, than the job effect, was because of this fear of China and what this means for the U.S. if China is going to dominate every big, important, strategic industry in the future. And during this period, of course, and we've seen other graphs like this, the trade deficit grew, and this was a big part of this, that after China joined the WTO, trade imports just took off into the U.S., but there was never an export response, so people couldn't move to the other industries. But it also meant that China really was moving up the value-added scale into all these new industries, and that deficit was problematic, both because it meant the U.S., it was a drag on growth in the U.S., and the U.S. wasn't getting those manufacturing jobs. So it's kind of evidence of what was going on from both sides of the China shock, whether you want to think about it as the manufacturing side or the kind of strategic side. So starting with Trump first 1.0, the big target during that period was China. We've all seen these graphs where tariffs were put on China at a very high level. And before these tariffs went into effect, there was a lot of fear of what was going to happen. It wasn't as bad as I think some economists thought it was going to be in terms of putting, 25% tariffs on about 60% of Chinese imports. I mean, I'm not sure they were all applied at that level, but it was quite shocking and a sudden change in trade policy, and it did lead to decoupling. So what we saw is just in a really short period of time, so in 6 years from 2017 to 2023, China's share of US imports fell by 8 percentage points, something that had taken twice as long to go up. So it can come down a lot more quickly than it can go up, and other countries benefited. So not everyone has been a loser from this policy. There are countries that are able to pick up some of that manufacturing, though in some more recent work we've looked at, and some of this is actually transshipment. So if you control for transshipment and you control for de minimis, actually the main country replacing China is China. So China went from direct exports to exports through transshipment and de minimis. Now, of course, those are being cut off as well, those channels. So then what happened under Biden, he expanded the tariffs and added, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the industrial policy then. So the focus was EVs. And what's striking in the EV industry is US was actually first with selling completely electric cars with Tesla in 2008, the Roadster. BYD started a couple years later, mainly with hybrids, and now, of course, is the world's largest seller of EVs. And there are so many different brands in China, but they're all completely out of the US market. So I did see a BYD in La Jolla recently, but it had Mexico plates because you can easily come across the border. And then this very kind of targeted scalpel-like approach to export controls was the other way. So there's always this challenge or tension between, are we trying to run faster than China, or are we trying to trip China up? And I think there's been a bit of both. Then there was the industrial policy. So $52 billion appropriated for semiconductor-related programs. Again, when this happened, US just isn't good at this. The biggest recipient of this money has been Intel, and then we know how it's turned out in the recent administration. But if we're really trying to push innovation and get ahead, I'm not sure Intel, the company that at the same time as it received $8 billion, its stock price fell in half, was the company that should be targeted. And then, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act with focuses on EVs and renewable technologies. One interesting aside on that is we think about Trump as not working with the allies. This was a case where Biden didn't initially as well. So this came out, none of the allies knew it was coming. And of course it affected Hyundai and VW and all these other companies that produced EVs as well. They complained, and eventually they had this weird workaround on leasing vehicles that you still got the same benefit, which ended up being hugely expensive. But it did bring the allies along. But just to say that when they first considered this, that was not at all a part of the agreement. So then we get to Trump, And he goes straight from the industrial policy to the tariffs. So he called the Chips and Science Act a horrible, horrible thing, and the Inflation Reduction Act a giant scam. And went back to the tariffs. But this again gets to the point that even if you're skeptical of industrial policy in the US, or even maybe alternatively, if you really like industrial policy and think that it was important we did those things, having it be inconsistent and unpredictable is certainly a way to make it not work. So another reason why this country just isn't set up like China with very much consistency in government and government policy that can make that can make industrial policy work. So I thought Doug was going to show this graph, so I was surprised he didn't, because he's one of the people who's put these types of graphs together, showing how high tariffs have been in the past. Compared to that, post-war, we're at the highest we've been. So it's really shocking. The April 2nd tariffs shocked markets, shocked everyone. Then there was some pullback. One thing that makes me a little less worried about continued movements in this direction is the market discipline that happened at this time. When bond yields started to go up and the stock market was crashing, immediately there was some pullback. And so I do think there's market discipline on the absolute worst policies because because the government won't be able to continue, especially given how much debt there is to refinance if bond yields go up. So why do this new trade policy? And this is where there's been a real shift in this administration. So one is to raise revenue, but even with the amounts coming in, we're talking about a small percentage compared to income taxes, reshore manufacturing. But we've talked all about global value chains here, and it's hard to think how that's going to work in a world of global value chains if you're taxing all those imports and stages of production. Another is to retaliate for bad behavior. And I think that's the biggest part of what this is, but then you need to be really strategic about it. And I think more work from academia on what exactly that small yard high fence should be, because otherwise that yard's going to keep getting bigger. So what does an optimal small yard look like? And how do you build that high fence so it doesn't have unintended consequences? Then there's this reverse trade deficits. But you can do that bilaterally. The tariffs on China did reduce the bilateral deficit, but the aggregate deficit is going to be driven by macro factors. I don't have to explain that at the Fed. So this thing of tariffing the world isn't going to work unless that makes us switch away from consumption to saving. And then there's this new thing that the Trump administration added, which is about reimbursing for public good provision. So the U.S. is the biggest military spender and the provider of global reserve assets. So the rest of the world should pay a tax because of that, and they should be willing to accept tariffs because we provide these things to the world. So this is a new rationale that they sometimes also bring up. And then when all of this, I think, is really coming mostly from the right side of the first picture I presented, which is the threat of China. And there's a lot of focus on shifting away from China as a supplier. China supplies 15% of global exports, and there are many industries like solar panels, batteries, where it's the dominant force. But the US is 15% of global imports, and I think we sometimes forget that, and it's really hard to find a consumer to replace the US consumer. So the tariffs actually, there is the monopoly power in trade argument for tariff that if the US demand declines, there's nowhere else to send that. There's too many goods in the world, so market prices fall. So there's kind of this supply side monopoly power China has, but US does have a demand side monopoly power, and that's why all these deals have been reached. So what's striking is that I really thought there'd be a lot more retaliation than there is. China's really the only major player that is not, and I guess India to some extent, that has not completely just said, okay, we'll accept these tariffs, we'll invest in the U.S., we'll do what you want. So we see this list, and even Switzerland recently signed on. I mean, countries the chips keep falling. I was at a policy conference in Japan during Liberation Day, and there was someone from the EU there, and she said, of course EU is going to respond. China said, of course they're going to respond. But ultimately, again, going back to one of the reasons for tariffs, the security, Europe didn't respond. So, so we're now in this situation where they accepted the trade deals. So what happens? Well, U.S. imports remain high. So what's striking about all these policies is they're inconsistent, incoherent, but I don't want to say they're inconsequential, but so far they've been a lot less consequential than maybe we thought they would be. So U.S. imports remain high. Manufacturing employment, however, is not increasing. Paul showed this same chart yesterday, so it's not having the reshoring effect, at least yet. But tradables aren't driving inflation. So when you look at the inflation data, the biggest problem is getting gas to customers and all the infrastructure around that. But the really tradable products like apparel and new vehicles on here aren't high up on the inflation list. Of course, the Brazil tariffs have fed in to meat and coffee and other things, but we just haven't, when you look at the detailed inflation data, it's really hard to say inflation has been driven by tariffs. It's mainly coming from the services sector. I pulled data right around the time of the Liberation Day tariffs, but before there could be any effect from Amazon. They have bestsellers, so it's like 6 industries and the 20 best-selling products. And then I've been pulling it occasionally ever since. And if you look at the distribution of price changes from then to now, it's actually very slightly negative. So, and these are things that are coming, mainly from China, but from all over the world. And there just hasn't been a huge increase. I did look at these products on the far right, and they're actually books that I think were popular before and maybe out of print. So it wasn't something, it wasn't a tradable that explains that. So finally, what happens next? Well, I think there's kind of this fragile path forward where there's market discipline on extreme policy changes from either China or the US. There is continued decoupling, at least of direct linkages, and increased regional fragmentation. We see Trump definitely playing the security card around the Western Hemisphere and trying to be kind of the regional leader. But there are a lot of risks to this outlook. One is spiraling protection. If others do, domestic things can change, and at some point Europe might say we do need to respond. Others might say that. All these me-first industrial policies could pile up and be problematic. We could see a financial crisis starting from this AI bubble or political action. There's lots of things that could happen politically to challenge this outlook. And then I think, and I'm going to end a little bit where Doug did about security, that I think the access to critical minerals, strategic goods, and thinking much more about security and economics is really where we need to go. Because when I go to conferences like this and I'm with all the security folks, all they talk about is more export controls and more industrial policy. And we need to at least help guide that a little bit more. Thank you.
And our final speaker is Karen Dinan.
Thank you. It is great to be here. Clicker to work, yes. Oops. Yeah, so we're all talking about industrial policy. The graph on the left here just shows mentions of industrial policy in the business press, and you can see how the mentions have gone up in recent years. But it's not just that, of course. We're seeing all these studies come out of think tanks. I know in my macroeconomics class, I just added a lecture on industrial policy. We're having panels about industrial policy at big conferences like that. I don't think any of this would have been happening 10 years ago. The graph on the right is kind of interesting. It's a number of new measures of industrial policy from an IMF paper that just came out. It only goes through 2022, so it doesn't capture the most recent industrial policy measures. What you can see here is industrial policy has expanded in recent years. What's also interesting about the graph, though, is that it's not a new thing by any means in the 2020s, even in the advanced economies. I think a lot of people thought, oh, advanced economies, we abandoned all of this in the kind of 80s and 90s because we rejected this idea of picking winners. But, we've had industrial policy. I do think, as I'll explain, the focus has in some ways changed, and in some ways kind of just the packaging of industrial policy. In the United States, we of course, have had some very notable industrial policy in the last few years. The other panelists talked about this. 2022 was a big year. We had the Chips and Science Act. It was $280 billion of spending in industrial policy to support those industries. The middle graphic is, it says Democrats' Climate and Health Bill. That's referring to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. That has turned out to be a much bigger bill. I think it's pushing, Caroline had 500 billion. I think the most recent numbers are more like 800 billion. And then, of course, industrial policy has continued under the Trump administration. Caroline talked about tariffs. Doug mentioned some other examples. The thing that really caught my eye was the 10% stake in Intel that occurred last August. And I'll come back to why that caught my eye, but the president has talked about taking stakes in other companies as well. So more on U.S. industrial policy, I think it's showing both change and continuity. Reducing exposure to global supply disruptions, that's gotten much more attention since COVID. Advancing the green transition, that was pushed by the previous administration, but of course it's been rejected by the current administration. Enhancing national security, that has been a consistent priority across recent administrations. And then an enduring objective is just increasing economic growth and creating job opportunities, or sometimes they'll say good job opportunities. So with that background, let me make 3 points. Okay, so the first one's going to be improving policies apart from industrial policy should be the starting point for policymakers. The second point, industrial policy opens a Pandora's box of complications. And the third is responding to the rise of China. I think it's a special case. So, starting with improving policies apart from industrial policy, I'll just say here, there are a bunch of areas where there's scope to do more, maybe much more in some of these cases. And it's also the case that in these areas, the complications, at least what we think are the risks and trade-offs, are fewer than with industrial policy. And then these are also areas where we have more rigorous research to document that these things are actually constructive for our economy. So starting with the objective of,
When you hit the ceiling.
That's a ceiling? Okay, there you go. Okay, if your objective is to increase growth and job opportunities, traditional policies, the most effective way to do this. I would have put, Doug put R&D as in the industrial policy bucket. I would have just put it in the bucket of traditional policies, but that's certainly something that is well documented to move the needle there. There's scope to improve K through 12 education, as well as training and apprenticeship programs. We should be facilitating the immigration of high-skilled workers. We should be maintaining a competitive business tax code. We should be keeping a stable and balanced regulatory environment, as well as a stable and balanced global trading system. And of course, there's more scope to operate federal, state, and local government more effectively. But I think all of these areas are areas in which there's a lot of scope to do more, and that would be more importance in terms of promoting economic growth and job opportunities. Coming to reducing exposure to supply disruptions, I think the only practical solution there is to maintain a stable global trading environment and also to foster our relationship with allies. We talked a lot over the last day and a half about the complexity of modern production systems. I have a graphic on this slide from an ECB paper. I think in hindsight, I would have taken something nice from Sebnan's work. She had excellent graphs yesterday that made the same point. But, you know, as we heard yesterday, the modern system is just very complex, and there are just so many interconnections. This makes reducing exposure to global supply disruptions through industrial policy extremely difficult. Robust supply chains, that's going to take understanding who the suppliers are of key materials, but not just that, it's the suppliers of the suppliers, and then the suppliers of the suppliers of the suppliers, and so on down the chain. So, you know, to try to do that for many goods, that just amounts to central economic planning, just not practical, which is why the practical solution here is a stable global trading environment. Okay, and then lastly, if your goal is for a successful green transition, there are broader policies than the ones that we are effectively pursuing right now. For doing that, support for clean energy R&D, I suppose someone might say, well, that's in a form of industrial policy, but it's certainly not the way kind of we're approaching it. Streamlining permitting for energy production and transmission. I am delighted to see that area of policy getting more attention now. I think it's just low-hanging fruit for accelerating the green transition. Likewise, kind of breaking down the obstacles to kind of an appropriate expansion of nuclear power. And then lastly, as an economist, I just have to say, don't forget about those mechanisms that effectively price carbon. I'm not naive about the gigantic political obstacles to that, but I just think, you know, that really is something that is so powerful and that we need to keep pushing for. Okay, so Great. Second point, industrial policy opens up a Pandora's box of complications. And this is something my fellow panelists have already talked about. But yes, it does. Okay, so there are all the traditional concerns about industrial policy, particularly when it's not crafted very effectively. This is a slide, in fact, I think I pulled it right from the deck that I used to teach my class, but these are kind of the traditional objections we have. Information failures, governments may misjudge the sectors that merit support. This is the picking winners argument that we hear so often. Fiscal strain, we've already, my fellow panelists also talked about kind of the large burden on governments that can be associated with industrial policy, and that's particularly true because industrial policy is often hard to unwind. It often doesn't have kind of some sort of mechanism that's going to unwind it after a period. Loss of competitive pressure, that's another huge one that's been documented in kind of lots of cases of failures of industrial policy. That's certainly kind of an element behind the cell phones in Argentina argument that Doug was making. The protection just dulls incentives to innovate or cut costs, and then you end up with cell phones that are twice as expensive as the other ones that consumers could buy if you didn't have those barriers. And then there's the cross-border spillover. So trade measures, as we've seen, as Caroline talked about, they can provoke retaliation. Trade measures and kind of industrial policy more broadly can end up spurring copycat policies in other countries. Okay, recent U.S. Industrial policy, it suffers from what is sometimes called the everything bagel problem. To quote Ezra Klein, everything bagels are, of course, the best bagels, but that's because they add just enough to the bagel and no more. And one problem liberals are facing is that they often add too much. I have a picture of an everything bagel here from Wikipedia, and actually I think it does kind of suffer from an everything bagel problem, but you see kind of the you know, it doesn't look like the best bagel because it's just got too much on it. But, you know, this is, critics of the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act have argued these initiatives just tried to serve too many objectives at once. They put too much on the bagel. Each law was seeking simultaneously to create good jobs, to accelerate the green transition, to strengthen supply chains, and to advance national security. So this is an everything bagel strategy. It risks blurring priorities. It weakened the effectiveness. I mean, I think we heard specific stories in particular around kind of the creating good jobs that, you know, as defined by the Biden administration, you know, there were so many kind of add-on features as to what was a good job, childcare, training, unions, that it just increased the cost of trying to open a semiconductor plant in the United States. And so, you know, we saw kind of foreign producers saying, we just can't do it there. It doesn't make economic sense. So it was just kind of like right, you know, flying in the face of the objective that they were trying to achieve. And then lastly, and Doug talked about this a bunch, the political challenges. So, you know, we're talking about selective government treatment, and that in and of itself is problematic. And I can say just from my own experience at the Treasury Department, you can try to say this is going to be apolitical. We're going to kind of hand the decisions to the technocrats who are sitting up on the third floor and just let them go at it and do a really objective job of deciding who's in and who's out. But you know, they don't have full information about everything that you want to weigh. And moreover, they don't know what the weights are that they should put on the different elements that you're considering there. You know, furthermore, at the end of the day, you're probably going to end up with a list of people who seem to be qualified over in the West Wing, and you're going to be in somebody's office, and they're going to be looking down the list, and they're going to be thinking about the political people. They're going to be thinking about, well, are those our friends, or are they not? So it's just kind of inherent to industrial policy. From the firm side, it increases the incentive to attempt political capture, of course, because of the benefits that firm is going to receive. You know, increases the consequences of being successful. This is going to encourage lobbying. I want to be in the program. designed the bill this way. It's going to facilitate corruption, as Doug was saying. It's going to increase the risk of companies becoming too important to fail. And here I want to come back to the U.S. government taking a stake in Intel last summer. This is kind of a move towards creating something that's quasi-public-private. We saw this with Fannie and Freddie before the financial crisis. This creates all sorts of kind of just problems and weakens market discipline in ways that can kind of end in a very bad way. Okay, so last point I want to make is I do think responding to the rise of China is a special case. Here, it's an economic power that rivals the United States. So yes, its nominal GDP is still below our nominal GDP. Yes, its average standard of living is well below that in other advanced economies, but as other speakers have underscored, it's a dominant supplier in key global markets, rare earth minerals, solar panels, heparin, and so on. It's deeply integrated across many supply chains, and we know initiatives like Belt and Road are just aimed at kind of deepening those connections further. Okay, so you've got this large economic rival. At the same time, China is seen as a geopolitical and military adversary. So this is a combination the United States has not faced before, at least in recent history, and as a powerful combination. So that economic leverage, for example, can be used for strategic or coercive purposes, picking up on one of the themes that we discussed yesterday afternoon. So both dimensions, and certainly the combination of these two features, argue for a policy that is deliberate, coordinated, and long-term in focus. So where I come out is some industrial policy probably is warranted for China-related vulnerabilities. I think industrial policy can be justified to build supply chains for key defense items domestically or with long trusted allies. I think industrial policy can be justified to support the build out of capacity domestically in strategic sectors like semiconductors, but there are a lot of buts there. That first of all, the range of goods implicated needs to be narrow. So you can't be kind of a long list of goods. Then you're moving back towards central planning. And I think all of the other kind of caveats that would apply about designing the stuff well to avoid the Pandora's box of complications, I think those all apply. It's not an easy thing to do, but there is a lot of writing about best practices in this area. And I would also say, returning to kind of my first theme, that you want to still have those complementary policies to strengthen national security, such as promoting innovation, such as R&D and skilled immigration. And then I think I'll just end the same place that Doug and then Caroline ended with this point about our research. Doug said that it's so hard to capture non-economic benefits in our research, and I would agree with that, but I also think Caroline made a really important point, which is that those non-economic benefits are so important, and at the end of the day, they are going to be part of the cost-benefit calculation that the leaders of our country are doing. So if we don't do it, who is going to do it? So I would challenge all of you economists out there to think about how, when we analyze these things, not just to dwell on the costs and the risks associated with industrial policy, but to think about how can we embody these non-economic benefits in our analyses. So with that, thank you very much.
Well, thank you all very much for that. So I was asked to start things off with a couple questions of my own, so I'll indulge in that prerogative. I wanted to start very broad. As you alluded to, it's impossible to imagine this policy having taken place at this event 10 years ago. At least that's my perception of the way the winds have changed. On a scale of kind of fundamentals have changed, and that's why we're talking about it, to, fads happen, and this is a fad. Where would you lie on that? Like, the rising importance of discussing industrial policy, and of course policymakers thinking about it and enacting it. Where do you put that kind of the causes of that underlying change? Doug, you can start. Yeah. Yeah, take that.
I think one of you made the point, the rise of China. I think we both made that in some sense. I think that really was a game changer in terms of rethinking U.S. security, where we were in terms of manufacturing and things of that sort. So I think it's largely that, a little bit of fad. These things come and go. But I think there's something real behind it. It's not just a political fashion.
I'm particularly interested in knowing like what the change in underlying market failures. If we're going to pin it on fundamentals in a traditional Pigouvian sense, what are those changing market failures that have arisen? If we're talking about fundamentals.
I do think the fundamental is in the national security area, and I do want to just come back on that point just to double down on what Doug was saying. China is just viewed differently now than it was 10 years ago. I mean, I think for many, many years we thought, well, they'll, we'll open up the trading system, they'll, come into the global economy, their incomes will grow, and they'll become more like the advanced economies in terms of the degree of cooperation and the kind of relationship we have with them. And I just do think the big realization over the last half dozen years or 10 years maybe is that that's not the direction that they've gone in. I mean, they have not it's a different situation with China. They really are this seen as this geopolitical adversary in a way that we weren't thinking even 10 years ago.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, because I think what is the market failure is the right question for us as economists to think about this so we can come up with the right tool. But I think that's what makes it so hard, because it is the China threat. And then what is exactly the right tool for that? So, it's if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So to Trump, tariffs is the right tool for everything. Then China used industrial policy, so let's try that. It's not clear in my view, the best tool is the old tool, which is to lean into our strengths, which I mentioned at the beginning, immigration, education, and finance, but also work with our allies. So, because together we're actually a lot bigger than China and could lead the world. But we're now in a state where and that's where, again, I want to put it back on the economists to think more about these security issues, because I think it's really, really, really dangerous, the different policies and how companies are affected by those, and kind of the whole DeepSeek moment and all that.
Just to, on the market failure point, just to be a little more pointed, I don't know that I've seen the hard research to back this up, but I do feel like the traditional learning by doing justifications for industrial policy, where you get firms under-investing because, if they do invest and expand and train workers, they're not going to reap all of those benefits because, other firms will, start up and reap those benefits. I do think they apply in this area.
And more so than 10 years ago?
I think the thing that has changed relative to 10 years ago is kind of the need to have kind of these industries either with our allies or in our country. So I think that is the thing that's changed, but I think the thing that justifies, well, why would you have some industrial policy? And as you can tell, I don't think that is the best starting point, but the thing that could justify it would be the learning by doing, the infant industry.
So you all touched on the national security motive in various ways, and I like the way you all put it, that we need more economic research on that, and then how economists can weigh in on that point, because we're good at weighing in on things. So my next question is to ask you all to start on that. So for the grad students in the room, I don't actually see any, but I guess we're all, so we're at
It's a Saturday
some
morning.
level we are all grad students, forever. Where would you point the researchers' efforts on that issue? Hard question, I know, to sort of write the future papers, but I know you've all thought a lot about this, so we'd love to know how you're doing that.
You want me to start? As I said, I think it's key strategic or defense-related sectors. I think that the advanced semiconductor industry, I think that's a big deal. That's a big deal in terms of defense technologies. And I think, if you read, for example, Chris Miller's book, it's actually rather scary how dependent we are on, for example, Taiwan. So, I think that's a kind of starting point.
I think it's, as I said before, I think it's really important to define the sectors really precisely that we're worried about and work with our allies on those sectors, because the problem if you don't is that the yard will just keep getting bigger. And so to really think about what the issue is for each of these things we want to focus on, and working again with our allies, because trying to do it all in the U.S., it is just not going to happen. We don't have the skills here. So that's one area. The other is on the innovation. So there are some papers that are coming out that are showing that actually, if you restrict access, you spur innovation abroad, because scarcity is certainly a push for innovation. That's why Israel's so great on defense. Or a threat. So in that sense, making sure that we have capacity in those sectors that are important. What I was going to say is the innovation abroad. So what we don't want, and we hear this from the chip producers in California all the time, it's hard to know if they're speaking their own book, or if and to what extent how big the thing is, but DeepSeek certainly changed the view that by restricting access, you encourage innovation, and then China's going to leapfrog and jump ahead even faster. And I think we could benefit from a lot of economic research on that, the push of innovation through restrictions, because that's a way to hold the government back a little bit and support what the tech industry's been saying.
I'd say go to economic history. There must be some good historical examples. And just to give you one, the British government issued a report before World War I, or maybe even in the early parts of the war, about thinking about how do we position our economy to deal with the German threat and being cut off. And I think, don't quote me on this, but if you look at their recommendations and their identification of vulnerabilities, it was very different from actually what happened, which just tells you war is so complex, you just don't know, and you cannot, it's very difficult to anticipate what the problems are going to be. There's a new literature in geoeconomics, which I think is promising, very early days on that. A lot of things hinge on risk parameters and probabilities of small probabilities of events, and I don't think we have a good sense for that. And the last thing is I think we need to open up a dialogue between the national security establishment and economists. So Emily Blanchard, my colleague, recently spent 2 years at the State Department as chief economist. She has incredible stories about the lack of economic thinking in national security. And once again, we don't have all the answers, but we have a framework for thinking through some of the potential answers. And just in terms of the China risk thing too, I know probably many people in this room and on this panel have talked to former economists in the Biden administration, the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, who served honorably. And I've always asked them one question. I said, how did your view of China change after you went into government and were read into the intelligence? And it's amazing the uniformity of answers. It's not Republican or Democrats, not Trump, Biden, Obama. It's, I went in sort of concerned, maybe read the Chris Miller book and, we're vulnerable in certain things. And I came out scared. In other words, it's much worse than we know or think. That frightens me. And that means I think we need to know more and get involved in government and take leaves and work and try to see what's going on and how we think about it.
Yeah, and just, and I already said this during my remarks, but just to push on that, I just think someone's going to be sitting there trying to do the cost-benefit analysis, and someone's going to have the person from the Defense Department with all the very scary stories. And then they'll have some kind of quantification of the cost from the economist. And I just feel like unless we can make more progress towards some sort of framework where how you kind of weave these two things together and somehow kind of quantify the benefits that can be compared with what the costs are, I just don't think, we're going to get the best decisions.
Here's just an indication of this uncertainty that we're facing. I sometimes read political scientists and national security experts just trying to get a read on what China's intentions are. There's no consensus. Do they just want to be a regional power? Do they want to displace the U.S.? Is it just Taiwan or is it more? There's a wide debate on exactly that issue. So it's going to be very hard to assess what do we do going forward if we don't even know what the other side is doing.
Thank you all for those. So I'm going to open up to questions. David Weinstein is a forward-looking economist who anticipated my move there. You can go first, David. Yeah.
Is this on? Is this on? Oh, yeah, it is. Great. I thought it was a great panel. And kind of my early, my misspent youth was on industrial policy. But it's great to see that it's all coming back. I'm not sure I'm convinced that China represents some sort of novel threat and that's what's causing everything. Because what I noticed is that people kind of missed or didn't talk about, what happened when we really faced a major threat, which was in World War II, right, where you had Japanese sinking battleships in Pearl Harbor and throwing us out of the Philippines, and we had the rise of Nazi Germany, and that started in the 30s. And there's been some really good work by Gross and Sempat, who have a nice AER paper on this, and then also kind of historians who also, Phillips O'Brien in particular, on how the war was won. And both of them, kind of coming from very different disciplines, kind of give a very different set of policies that they think was crucial. And that was the massive subsidization of research and development by the U.S. government in the Office of Science and Research and Development, right, which targeted 4 things. And when I say these 4 things, you're going to say, okay, this is why we won the war, right? Aerospace, we could napalm German and Japanese cities, and they couldn't do it to us, right? And if you want, just go online, you can see a bunch of Harvard professors detonating the first napalm blast in front of the business school. Or you had, the second big thing was computers, right? So bomb sites, we could read their codes, they couldn't read ours. Or nuclear technology, but don't need to explain that. Telecom and censoring technologies, right? Radar, sonar, all of that stuff, right? And so, and these things then led to very fast U.S. productivity growth in those sectors, right? Which they document mattered a lot in the 60s. So I think that raises a question. If last time we were faced with a very big threat, we took a very different set of policies. We didn't start going after the universities. We actually started partnering with the universities. Why is it that we're not doing that this time? And so one possible story is that national security is the last refuge of the protectionist. And what we're seeing is some other motivation for doing this. And a lot of you alluded to this idea that it's corruption, right? That this lets you become corrupt. And I'm not sure, right, I think we may be giving a little too much credit to the idea that the best way to deal with China is take a 10% position in NVIDIA. That doesn't seem like what I would, like that any rational thought process would say that's the way to handle this situation. And so I think we need to kind of think back to the history and go and say, well, we've dealt with existential threats before, and this is not how we did it. So why are we doing what we're doing?
Anyone like to? Please.
I just want to say one thing to that, because it was a great intervention. That's exactly what China's doing. So China's 2015 is what you just described that the US did. So, and they're leaning into their universities and working really closely with their universities. So actually that just made me more afraid. I completely agree the US response is the wrong response, but I still think it's driven by that.
I'll say, I thought it was a great intervention too, and I agree completely with what you're saying about the corruption and the motivation. But I do think it does depend on how you define threat. I mean, you kind of focused on the traditional military threats, and I think that's fair enough. That's certainly something that I mentioned in my remarks. But if you think the threat is we're going to kind of wake up tomorrow and suddenly the chips that are kind of in all of our cell phones and kind of all the other things that we depend on are no longer accessible to us, I think, maybe you could kind of then see, that could be pretty consequential for us.
Shebna.
Great panel. I would like to come back to this theme of, say the starting point is China, and there is a threat. But I do agree with David that government objection function is not clear, right? I think definitely not clear to us, but probably not clear to them, right? I mean, they might be trying to do many things, everything bagel thing. They might be corrupt and really afraid we will wake up and Taiwan invaded and all that. But I think there's also something about the way they think about the timing, right? Because if you look at, what is kind of happening, I mean, okay, if you go now to Defense Department and talk to DARPA people, the three top national security priority is supply chain resilience, drones, and the dollar, right? Okay, but if that is the case, then the policies has to be somehow consistent, which Caroline is saying. And when we go back to the, say, the Biden CHIPS Act, now there are several papers showing, we know why it is done. National security is top, domestic employment, supply chain resilience, we want the chips produced here. But if you look at it, the maximum employment it created is around 50,000. But more importantly, 2/3 of that are foreign workers, right? Mm-hmm. So this goes back to this fact that, the figures I show, the figures Karen showed, we are in a world of not division of labor, but division of skill, division of knowledge. I mean, that's what the whole, this complexity of networks is, right? It's not just about trade, it's about production, and that is going to have this knowledge and skill part. So when China did the whole industrial policy, they understood this, right? Yes, it is consistent, but they had tons of US companies going and teaching them the technology, because they only let FDI, they had a very, very specific current account and capital account policy. They only let companies like Apple come and teach them. Okay, and then they build on that. Now, if we are doing this other side of it, and if we want to use our allies, then you would invest in, clean extraction of rare earths, which, of course, Northern Europe, Greenland, Brazil. But the administration is instead, well, I'm going to, occupy Greenland, right? So that is telling me, so even we don't know the objective function, or even maybe they are trying to achieve too many things and they are corrupt, but there has to be something about the timing. I mean, there is this urgency of doing this, because if we do invest in research and developments of, clean extraction technologies, then we are going to solve the rare problem. Same thing with the chips and semiconductors. Actually, rare earth is not the critical thing for chips and semiconductors. It is steel and aluminum. Look at what we are doing with steel and aluminum, right? And that is explained by, of course, Pennsylvania and votes from Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of things here I think they are trying to hit. Maybe plus they are also corrupt. We don't know that. But so it is just like, so this, and we do know there are super, super smart people in DC thought about this now, over 10 years. So why not, invest in research and development so that can achieve all these things. To me, only thing is there has to be something imminent here, imminent fear of something, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Do you want to take a few? Or
if you could answer that question, and then the next round we'll take two. Yeah.
I mean, I think the thing is that in this room, we probably all agree that research and development is the way to deal with this. I think the question is, how do we convince the national security folks that that's what we should be doing, is trying to run faster rather than coming up with all these kind of scattered policies, inconsistent and incoherent.
Thanks. Okay, Mary, Amidi, and Egon. Mary first. Please, we're down to 10 minutes, and I see like at least 5 or 6 tense up, so you got about a minute each. Max, including the answer. Go for it.
What about including the laughter?
Also costly. Yeah.
So in terms of the, everyone's making the case about the security and, mentioning China. Of course, one issue with the security argument is that, when the administration's saying that, having a current account deficit is a security issue, it's kind of like what really is security. But I wanted to kind of go back to follow on from Dave's earlier question about like what's changed our view about the industrial policy now, and whether and all of you mentioned China, but I was just wondering whether it's also something about like the increased fragmentation that we've had around the world, like different parts of the production stage is highly concentrated in different areas, different countries, and that trend's been increasing, and we know that there are gains from that, but there are also these obvious risks. And going back to the theme of the conference, I was just wondering whether that's also a factor that is affecting your view about industrial policy now.
And then.
I was just wondering if you could maybe tie some of the resurgence of these industrial policies to the discussion we had yesterday that Jeff Frieden pointed out that it seems like industrial policy is something that it's also amenable. You could communicate that the benefits to a small group of people, in a sense it's concentrated, it's going to bring back jobs. So in other words, not just the external security threat component, but kind of the domestic political component that plays to that.
Would anyone like to offer thoughts on those two questions? Either of the two, or both?
To marry those two, so to speak, those two comments, I think COVID was another thing, fragmentation, and then your point about selling it in terms of jobs, and then Pete's and the other points about the loss of manufacturing jobs. All these things sort of go together in some sense in mutually reinforcing ways.
Yeah, with what Mary said, I think that that's a big part of it is this extraordinary specialization. So you have, TSMC producing over 90% of the highest end chips. ASML is the only producer of that equipment that you need to produce those chips. So it's just this incredible concentration in things, and then China with 90% of the rare earths, to this incredible concentration in things that we think are necessary for security. And that's again where I think if there could be a paper that came out and said, these are the 18 things we need to protect and really, really focus on from academics, really well researched, that would help, because otherwise this stuff is just spreading all over. And on the jobs, I just want to refer to the bagel. I think that was the problem with the CHIPS Act, was having daycares and saying that it was about jobs, and that's a problem to sell stuff politically in this country, and why we're so bad at industrial policy, because we have to hit all these different goals.
I'll just say, yeah, I see the through line between both of these, and I think they're both right. I think these are things that we kind of have woken up to. You know, the fragmentation, the risks associated with fragmentation. I think, you know, the post-COVID experience with shortages just kind of woke us up to, wow, this is a real risk here. Yeah, and the jobs. I mean, I think between the kind of, you know, the literature around the China shock and kind of also just a recognition of all this political dysfunction that's come out of people and regions being left behind, have just kind of increased kind of the focus or the desire to do more place-based policies. So I think that is an underpinning as well.
Thank you. Okay, so two questions at the same time, Richard and Peter Shaw. Pardon me? Oh, okay, and we got to save time for two more after that, so please 1 minute each, including the answer. Thanks.
Just building, Karen, and maybe the others on what you just said about specific dysfunction, political dysfunction, and the causes of it. None of you has explicitly mentioned inequality, and it just strikes me that growing inequality is definitely a factor that's driving some of the political dynamic behind industrial policy. And Karen and Caroline and Doug, you all talked about the right policies, like R&D, like others. The impact of those policies is likely to be caught up in what we might call a tragedy of the horizon. In other words, we can invest in them now, but the impact is likely to accrue only slowly, not just to the innovator, but slowly over time. Whereas industrial policy, we can do that with a snap of a fingers, you know, the writing of a Sharpie, and that's something that is very expedient from a political standpoint. People have to get reelected.
Pete.
Ron, I found all the discussions fantastic, and I certainly believe the China shock was severe. But I was struck by Carolyn's comment that it was the 2015 or 2025 plan. You know, China was fine.
It was in 2025, but
looking toward 20. Yeah.
In China 2025.
So you know, China was fine until China wasn't fine, and I'm wondering, maybe this doesn't matter, but you know, I'm wondering how much is this the rise of Xi Jinping as opposed to the rise of China. And that kind of then raises the question of how much is this about Trump as opposed to our fear of China. And I think I would echo David's point about you know, is this a vehicle for getting something else that you want as opposed to. So I was then struck by the comment of, you know, anybody who's looked at the data, the secret stuff is terrified. So I'm kind of wondering, what is that secret stuff that's so terrifying? And then if it's so terrifying, why don't we get told about it? So anyway.
Any quick reactions? And then we'll go to Tristan and Karine.
I want to quickly react to what Dick was saying about the inequality. I just want to say I don't think it was just inequality. It was kind of a sense of unfairness, a sense the system is rigged. So I don't think it's the inequality per se, but kind of broader things going on there. But I also want to say, you know, the R&D, the innovation policy, and Heidi Williams has a nice paper with some co-authors in the Journal of Economic Perspectives about innovation policy. But, you know, she has a list of 10 different innovation policies and what the literature says about them, and then what the impact is going to be on inequality. And a lot of these things that we do to spur innovation, there is a fundamental trade-off that they're going to increase inequality. So, you know, there's a bit of a problem there.
I was going to make that same point, once again, linking various comments. If we really want to ramp up R&D and innovation, where is that going to take place? California, Massachusetts, you know, and so the inequality, we're going to be spending more money in precisely those areas, not in Ohio necessarily or Kansas or what have you. I also blame Xi.
Yeah.
So if you look at the leadership in the 1990s and early 2000s in China, Zhu Rongji, very liberal, very open-minded, market-oriented in many ways, and for whatever reason, I haven't studied, she is very different. And so I don't know why that came about, but I do put a lot of the blame in some sense on him and the change in the well, if you look at, there's always been factions, and so it's just a question of which factions, and here's where we're to blame, the financial crisis. Because there's a great anecdote in Hank Paulson's book about dealing with China, where he says, you know, Chinese authorities were saying to him, we looked up to you. We thought you were the model, and we see you're not the model. And so that may have shifted the dynamics in the party, and then you get someone like Xi.
Okay, Tristan and Karim, please.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to be fast. So at the World Bank, I have a forthcoming book written with Ana Fernandez about industrial policy for development. And so I wanted to share 3 messages from that and hopefully reactions to not reactions to what was said. So the first is that, you know, the countries that have the most to benefit from industrial policy, developing countries, are also the least able to execute it. And on the development side, so the benefit side, I think we're a bit pessimistic. I mean, Doug cited Dave's work on non-transformative impacts. A lot of this recent modeling is all static, so it doesn't account for, you know, dynamic benefits. On the constraint side, you know, countries have fiscal constraints. They have small markets, but that's led them to emphasize one thing that didn't get talked about here, which are public inputs. So industrial parks, market access assistance, skills development programs, quality infrastructure. A lot of countries are doing this with a sort of sector focus, and they call it, you know, productive development policy or industrial policy. So that's been the focus. The second message is that it seems that if there were failures in the past, success may be more replicable than before. It's because countries have bigger middle classes, they have larger domestic markets, there's more talent in government. And I think we think that the political economy is a bit better too. Like, you know, inflation is under control, you have much better health delivery. That's not just talent in government, but it's also better politics. And then the third is that I think we should be really skeptical of these cross-country comparisons of the practice of industrial policy. The GTA statistics that Karen put up, which are also done by the IMF, you know, those make it look like it's all happening in advanced economies, but they're undercounted by that data set. So one fact that you should take away is that developing countries all have higher tariff levels, and they also have higher variance in tariff rates across products within the country. So they're definitely trying to be strategic to some extent. Finally, I'll just close on China. So there have been these estimates of how much China is spending. 4% is the sort of largest number from the IMF. You compare that to estimates of OECD, it's like 1%. We took the IMF data on sort of budget direct transfers to firms, and you add that to World Bank estimates of tax expenditures for businesses. For upper middle income countries, that's about 4% of GDP. So by that approach, China and other countries, at least at that income level, may be, you know, spending the same amount. Now, China may be more effective. Surely its GDP is a lot larger, so it's more important. But I think we should be very skeptical about these comparisons across countries. Thanks.
Great.
Quick question. So the Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, has been lobbying to ease export restrictions on his high-end chips to China. Pretty fraught decision, it seems, and wondering where the panel would come down on that, and also what you think will actually happen.
Okay, who would like to take a stab at either or both of those questions?
Just on the last one, I don't know anything really about the export controls, but it strikes me that he's a rent seeker.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem. All the chip makers say that. At the same time, there's clearly some truth that the more we restrict, the faster. And I mean, but now that cat is out of the bag, so China's trying to do everything it can. So maybe at this point, restricting is the right thing. But there's also the issue of the profits from the chips going into research here. So it's really, really complicated.
I guess it's really, really complicated, as Caroline was saying. I don't know. I don't know where to come out on it, because I do think there are considerations on both sides, and I think this is just a good example of why it is. As much as I think economists don't want to, you know, they just feel like industrial policy, I don't really want to study it. It's so messy to study, but kind of we need to be weighing in more on this.
Okay, guys. We all want to express our gratitude. Thank you so much for putting so much thought into this and your insights. We're very grateful. Thank you. Susan. Yeah.
Well, wow.
and I'm just looking at all of the people who are still here on a Saturday morning.
Oh, just a second. Maybe.
So, I mean, clearly we have covered a lot of ground. I am on the program listed for closing remarks. And just to be totally clear, I am not going to try to summarize the very varied, wide-ranging, informative, provocative conversations we've had. I'm not going to try to draw conclusions. What I am going to say is that I hope the conversation isn't closed, but that we have actually helped to draw more collaborations and more engagement. Clearly, the global landscape is changing in a variety of very complex and important ways, and it's important for us to understand that. Clearly, there are implications for the U.S. economy, and so, but many complexities. Complexities we've heard about in terms of measurement, in terms of modeling, in terms of characterizing, and so, again, I hope that that for you, like for me, this has really, been inspiring and interesting, informative, and raised a lot of questions of things that we can continue to explore. So I hope that, I do have a couple of things that I want to do, which are more kind of wrap up. But I hope all of you can stay. We have lunch and continue that conversation, and then the discussions and engagement and collaboration continues well beyond that. So a couple of notes. One is, this is our 69th conference, as you know, and we intend to have continued annual economic conferences, and so we want to learn what you thought went really well and if there are things that you would, have suggestions for. So there's a brief survey, so please fill it out. We would appreciate that, and you can just leave it there. All of the presentation slides will be on the conference website by Tuesday. And by the end of the week, we would expect to have the video recordings being available as well. And so, again, we intend and want to be a resource and want to be valuable and helpful for folks. There's a lot of thank yous, and our ability to be able to really focus on the excellent presentations and have the engaged discussion really requires all of the people behind the scenes who are doing a huge amount of work and effort. And so just wanted to call out some of the groups and then a couple of key individuals as well. So, our Res G, we call them, so our space sites, and then also our catering services, making sure that no one was going to go hungry as part of our gathering is important, and they play a really essential role in terms of our conference gatherings. And I've heard a lot about the excellent meals, and I'm glad people enjoyed those. We also have a very strong AV team, and so, wanted to recognize them for supporting the presentations for those here, but, our virtual presenters as well. And then all of our building services, including our, security services and everybody making sure that things could work smoothly. So, in addition, I do want to do, and saving a couple of key people for the end, for the recognition. We mentioned at the beginning, I mentioned my gratitude to the economic research team for all the work that they have done to organize, pull together speakers, presentations, but in particular the sponsors from our research team who really assembled the agenda and the speakers. So Omar Barbier, Slavik Shimerov, Alvaro Silva, and Hillary Stein. And I just wanted to give them a round of applause. Thank you. It's really, I have to say, such an engaged group of presentations. And then all of the presenters, and we have on each session, the presenters, that means the paper authors, the panelists, the discussants, moderators, and also all of you, a collective round of applause for all of that kind of collective material that was shared with all